March 1958, and the future for a country railway line in the heart of Sussex looked bleak. British Railways had just closed the route. The station buildings were due to be pulled down, and the tracks were expected to be ripped up. Without the vision of 4 young students, the chances are demolition might well have happened, with the branch line now long forgotten. Instead, this award-winning line made history. It's credited as the pioneer of one section of the British railway heritage scene, moving preservation from solely narrow gauge to standard gauge railways. Had the UK's first volunteer-run standard gauge line not proven successful, then the 100 or so other standard gauge heritage railways within the British Isles today would probably never have entered preservation. Since the reopening of a section of the Lewes to East Grinstead line in 1960, the superb all-steam Bluebell Railway has grown to become one of the top tourist attractions in Sussex, with a multi-million-pound turnover and trains running 275 days a year. Passing through 9 miles of stunning English countryside, the journey transports passengers back through time. Travelling from the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway's Sheffield Park station of the 1880s to 1930s horsted canes decked out in Southern Railway livery, and onwards to British Railway's Kingscote station of the 1950s. Bluebell Line volunteers lovingly strive to preserve every detail of a charming country branch line with authentic steam locomotives, coaches, goods wagons and even signalling systems. Opening on the 1st of August 1882, initially the branch line prospered, but even before the First World War, the route began suffering from underuse. By the 20s, the line had been taken over by the Southern Railway, but increased competition from road haulage meant rail transportation for freight was uneconomic. In an effort to reduce costs, the stations and goods yards along the line succumbed to rationalisation, but it was not enough to halt the line's decline. By the mid-1950s, British Railways shut the line, but was forced to briefly reopen the route before permanent closure in 1958. The Lewes and East Grinstead Railway Act was granted in 1877, with the line finally opening 5 years later. For a while, the line, intended primarily to transport goods and produce, flourished, but then fate intervened. Even before the start of the First World War, freight transportation on the branch was in decline, and the line experienced its first round of rationalisation. When the Southern Railway took over in 1928, it too demolished buildings, footbridges and signal boxes in an effort to reduce costs. By the 1930s, passenger numbers in the sparsely populated area had decreased dramatically too. With few passengers and no freight, the line struggled through railway nationalisation in 1948. British Railways soon wanted to close the line, submitting the first proposal for closure in 1954. But this was stopped by local residents. Claiming the line was too expensive to operate, British Railways secured approval to close the line in February 1955. And on the 28th of May that year, the route closed without ceremony.
Previously to closure, they'd done a lot of engineering work on it. They did in those days to make it look as though it wasn't paying.
Closure should have been the end, but for the diligence of a local lady.
One of the residents of Newark and Chailey, Miss Madge Bessemer, discovered there was an Act of Parliament that said that the line should never close.
The original Transfer Act contained a clause relating to the statutory line, requiring the LBSCR to run a minimum service. British Railways was obliged to honour this legal requirement and was forced to reopen the line just over a year later, on the 7th of August 1956.
We had to run 4 trains each way a day. Until they repealed the Act, they couldn't close the railway down, so they just ran these 4 trains. At the most awkward time, it didn't connect with anything else.
The line became known as the sulky service. Trains no longer stopped at Barkham nor Kingscote. Horsted Keynes was only saved by its electrified line to Haywards Heath via Ardingly. As the debate about non-profitable routes raged, the line achieved national fame and gained a new name.
The original title was the Lewes and East Grinstead Railway, and the local press found it a bit of a mouthful. So the local resident came up with the fact, it was called the Bluebell Line because the trains were so slow you could stop and pick bluebells.
A public inquiry followed in 1957. But eventually, the Minister of Transport authorised closure.
I was on the last train in 1958, the 428 from East Grinstead to Lewes, 9 coaches long, all packed in like sardines, and people pulled the communication cord. We turned up at Lewes about 40 minutes late. And that we thought was the end of the line.
The last train ran on March the 16th, 1958.
But then there were 4 students, David Dallimore, Martin Eastland, Chris Campbell and Alan Sturt.
The students, inspired by the success of several narrow gauge railways which were already being run by volunteers, wanted to preserve the Lewes to East Grinstead line. Fred Miles worked at Horsted Keynes station at the time.
And one Sunday morning I was on duty at this station, Horsted Keynes, and I had a few schoolboys come along. They seemed to be rather interested in how the line ran, and they told me and the signalman that was here that they were going to reopen it. Of course, naturally, we laughed at them.
No one had attempted to preserve a standard gauge railway before.
But we were the first ex-British Railways branch to be taken over. They thought, well, amateurs can't run a standard gauge railway. The Festiniog had opened and the Calais Flint, but they were in Wales, where they were narrow gauge, and that's what was accepted. But when standard gauge came along, no volunteers can't run a railway like that. And then Bernard came on the scene and they had the first meeting.
Bernard Holden was one of the first adults to be involved with the students and chaired the inaugural meeting. The centenarian went on to become superintendent of the line and then president of the Bluebell Railway Preservation Society.
A few weeks after that, a few more people came along with the schoolboys. They seemed quite interesting. These seemed rather mature men, rather sensible businessmen of the world, but they got bitten by the railway mania. I might say that none of them worked on the railway. And they all started telling us they were going to see into the matter and open it up again. Of course, we laughed more at them. Told them there were plenty of jobs going on the railway if they were so interested in it. Offered to introduce them to our station master. No, they said they meant business, and of course we laughed at them.
At the initial meeting held in Haywards Heath on the 15th of March 1959, the Lewes and East Grinstead Railway Preservation Society was formed. A committee was appointed to look into the various options and also to negotiate with British Railways. The trustees concluded that a small segment of the line between Sheffield Park and Horsted Keynes could be operated with steam trains as a tourist attraction manned by volunteer staff. Changing its name to the Bluebell Railway Preservation Society at the second meeting, the way forward was agreed. Except the society didn't own the line, let alone any rolling stock. But they did have £940 raised at the first meeting. On the 12th of July 1959, a special Bluebell Run rail tour train brought people to the first open day at Horsted Keynes, and John Leroy, the society's first chairman, persuaded many visitors to become members and donate money. British Railway's initial purchase price was a staggering £75,000, but in the late summer of 1959, the offer was reduced to £34,000 for the whole line, including the track, buildings and land at Sheffield Park. As the society needed time to raise the money, British Railways agreed to let the volunteers into Sheffield Park on a rental basis.
I remember we rented the booking office for 5 shillings a week, and that got us in here to start work on the station. The line, the railway itself, was in good condition, because previously to closure they'd done a lot of engineering work on it.
Without explanation, that October, British Railways increased the purchase price for the line to £43,000. Unable to raise the funds, the railway agreed to a £2,250 annual lease, with a 5-year agreement signed on the 24th of December 1959. During the winter, volunteers set about refurbishing Sheffield Park Station.
The station house wanted painting and quite other bits and pieces wanted doing, but platform and all the rest of it. But we all got together, we painted the station up.
After lease payments, the society could just about afford to run its trains, but there was hardly any money left for anything else. Volunteers had little choice but to learn how to maintain and restore the engines and carriages themselves. The Bluebell Railway Preservation Society officially launched on the 19th of February 1960 at a public meeting held at Brighton Royal Pavilion. At the time, British Railways were being very supportive and offered the Bluebell Railway a Stroudley Terrier 060T plus 2 coaches for a grand total of £750.
Our very first engine was an engine like this, called Stepney.
The ex-LBSCR engine 32655 Stepney and coaches arrived in steam by rail in the spring of 1960.
They wouldn't let us into Horsted Keynes then because that was still open by British Railways.
With the platforms and goods yard at Horsted Keynes in use by BR, the Bluebell Railway trains had to terminate 500 yards south of the station on the single line track. The volunteers constructed Bluebell Halt, but without a run-round loop, a second locomotive was required. British Railways supplied a P-Class 31323, later to be named Bluebell, and at the end of July 1960, a light railway order was granted, allowing the railway to operate and carry the public.
And we opened the railway on the 7th of August 1960.
Large crowds turned out for the first public day.
Well, we started just a weekend. It ran for the first weekend and ran virtually to the end of October. The first return fare was 2 shillings and sixpence in the old money.
Visitor numbers seemed promising initially, but the society was cautious.
And there was always touch and go in those days because people only gave us 6 months.
Exceeding all expectations, the Bluebell Railway carried over 15,000 fare-paying passengers in that first short operating period. The volunteers had proved that it was possible to run a standard gauge heritage steam railway. History had been made.
Following year, in 1961, we ran in August for 16 days continuously, which was the first experiment. and we had special events.
By the end of 1961, 92,000 passengers had been carried, and on the 29th of October that year, a major milestone was achieved. The Bluebell Railway was allowed to operate from Horsted Keynes Station, and alongside British Railways at that.
We operated on one platform and they operated on the other, so the station was shared between the two of us.
A through train from London Bridge opened the 1962 season, with the 1st of April Bluebell Special carrying a specially invited guest, the infamous Dr. Beeching, who gave the railway his blessing and even became an honorary member of the Bluebell Society.
In 1962 we expanded the service a bit more, and so it went on. More and more days midweek during the summer. And that's when we started getting a very, very small full-time staff to help out.
Despite Dr. Beeching's support for the Bluebell Railway, the closure of the electrified Ardingly branch between Horsted Keynes to Haywards Heath was announced in 1963. October the 27th, a last day special train ran from Brighton to Sheffield Park, powered by the Bluebell's own Stepney and Birch Grove. The high point of 1964 was the arrival of number 32636 Fenchurch, the last Bluebell Railway loco to arrive in steam before the railway was cut off from the main line.
Line for Haywards Heath was shut. They left us magnificently isolated.
But worse was to come. BR's policies had changed and leases were no longer acceptable. British Railways pressed the Society for payment in full or face being closed down.
So we had to raise the money to buy the line, and it was touch and go. It really was touch and go. We could have lost it.
The Society entered into protracted negotiations with the by now hostile BR management team. A purchase price of £43,500 was agreed, but BR threatened to tear up the track if the full sum was not found within 2 weeks.
We tried to get the money up, but it fell, strangely enough, right in the middle of a credit squeeze.
The Society simply could not raise the funds. Instead, they devised a plan.
So we approached them, was it would be advantageous of them to accept the terms at least, and then they wouldn't get any bad publicity as being the person who stopped over 1 million passengers travelling on vintage steam trains.
An agreement was reached. A deposit of £23,000 was paid, with the balance of £20,000 spread over the following 5 years. But the Society actually managed to settle the balance in full 2 years ahead of schedule.
And I think that was about the best day. I think we actually bought the line, it was ours, and we've expanded ever since. That's what got us going, really.
The Bluebell Railway now boasted 8 locomotives and 12 carriages. If the Bluebell Railway has a philosophy, it's been to keep the past alive.
All of our stations are restored to a period of time.
And as you go up the line, it changes. You not only do you travel on the train, the various carriages of different ages, you travel through time.
So Sheffield Park is restored to the Victorian times.
And when you get to Horsted Canes, well, you've gone from 1882 to 1930. So everything there is in Southern Railway colours. We go beyond Horsted Canes and up through the half-mile long tunnel, which is the longest on any preserved railway at the moment. You come to Kingscote, which of course is 1955.
It's like a big theatre production really, and we're just the dressing that goes with it.
Even the station master's uniforms clearly distinguish the different eras.
This is the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway uniform from pre-1923. Couldn't really give you a date when they started wearing this type of uniform, almost certainly in the 1870s or 80s. And it's the frock coat and this pillbox cap, really.
It's the same with the advertisements you see on the station. They're enamel at Sheffield Park, they're pasted onto a board here at Kingscote, which is how they all ended up.
The railway occupied the whole of the Grade 2 listed Horsted Canes station and yards from 1965.
There used to be a big junction station with a line going off to Hayward Sea for the other direction, East Grinstead and Lewes, and it's got some of the biggest platforms and one of the biggest stations in the preservation world.
Despite being on a secondary line, the 1882 station buildings were grand. The Queen Anne country style was used by the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway all along the Lewes to East Grinstead line. Nowadays, the clock has forever stopped at Horsted Canes station. It's 1935, and this is reflected in the station's green and cream colour scheme of the Southern Railway. Upon entering the station platforms, manned by staff dressed in smart Southern Railway uniforms, travellers pass under the tracks via the subway to platforms 3 and 4. Here, the trains carry passengers north to the 1950s and south to the 1880s. On this platform stands the ex-W.H. Smith bookstall, originally from Manchester's London Road station, and the George V buffet and licence bar. Both help the modern day to melt away. When the station was built, 2 identical sets of buildings and canopies were erected on platforms 1 and 2 and platforms 3 and 4. The north signal box was demolished in 1914 as a cost-cutting measure. And to enable the south signal box to have a clear view of the northern tracks, the buildings on platforms 1 and 2 were totally demolished. The electric service to Haywards Heath ran from a canopy-less platform 1 for 25 years. Although the first step in restoration for platforms 1 and 2 was taken in the 1970s with the reinstatement of columns around the subway, it was 1992 when Bluebell volunteers began the re-erection of the canopy and the reconstruction of the buildings. Re-signalling at Horsted Canes included the reinstatement of platform 1. So on the 29th of September 1999, the platforms were renumbered, with the double-faced platform road nearest the booking office becoming platforms 4 and 5. To the south of the station is the original signal box. Built in 1882, the box has been in continuous use ever since. 7 extra levers were added to the signal box's 33-lever frame following the north box demolition. But more recently, the Bluebell Railway had all but outgrown the signal box. Fortunately, a new remote signalling system was devised. This recent re-signalling work is a complicated project, so the Bluebell Railway is currently using a temporary switch panel attached to the wall.
Every platform can be used bidirectionally, and it's an extremely flexible layout, but unfortunately it's not yet back on the levers. That will come soon. So in the meantime, he's put up a system by which we can work everything with switches and motors on the signals, and it's all interlocked by relays that's a fairly conventional sort of thing, but using it actually operated from switches screwed to the back wall is a bit less usual.
Finally able to focus on matters other than buying the line, one of the first projects for the Society in 1970 was the Covered Accommodation Appeal to provide a carriage shed at Horsted Canes. By 1971, a 4-road carriage shed had been erected, but it was too cramped for restoration work almost on completion. In 2001, the railway opened a major extension providing some of the finest restoration facilities available anywhere within the railway preservation scene. John Coleman has been a volunteer in the carriage and wagon works for over 20 years.
Well, at the moment we've quite a number of projects. The oldest one is the Stroudley 4-wheel brake third. The vehicle that is being restored from a condition where it's been a shed in an orchard for about 70 years and is in really quite a poor state when it came here. A lot of the frame of the body has had to be remade from new, which is very highly skilled work and takes great length of time to achieve the finished result. The vehicle is quite interesting in that it has seats that are plain wood and there are no partitions between the compartments, which will be quite strange. But in a lot of cases all the interior has to be researched and often remade from scratch. We can find parts and we can collect parts, but often they have to be copied or made from the drawings. So it is a long, painstaking effort. Very often they are 10 years, if they're a full restoration. The historic preservation aspects do tend to get put on hold from time to time because there are more urgent priority revenue earning things that need to be attended to. So these take up the workspace and the efforts of the volunteers and staff. So 10 years is roughly what it's going to take for a project of that sort of magnitude.
After many years in restoration, the Bluebell Railway has little choice but to keep most of the refurbished carriages in the open. Aware that storage under cover would save at least £150 per month per coach in repairs and maintenance work, not counting labour, the railway launched Operation Undercover in early 2000, purchasing a site adjoining Sheffield Park Station in March 2003.
The idea is to be able to keep about 15 to 20 coaches in it, working coaches in the dry, and there will also be a new museum as well, which will improve the experience of the visitor.
It's a big project. Quite a substantial came from the lottery. The rest we put ourselves.
The Heritage Lottery Fund provided £2.89 million towards the £3.9 million costs.
And the museum will be able to tell the story, the development of the railways, their decline, the coming of the preservation age and how Bluebell has evolved.
Since the 1960s, special events have been held by the Bluebell Railway, attracting a wide variety of visitors.
We do a number of different events during the course of the year. Some are geared up for family type people, like the Father Christmas train, Santa specials. Some are there for enthusiasts. We do the big Giants of Steam, which is all rail based.
One of the gala events, which for many of the volunteers marked the turning point for the Bluebell Railway, was the Bullied Day on the 15th of May 1976. As part of the celebrations, David Shepherd named number 21C123 Blackmore Vale. Nowadays, regular annual events include the Vintage Transport Weekend in August, with cars, motorcycles, traction engines and trains, and the Southern at War Weekend in May, when the busy stations and trains evoke a wartime nostalgia.
And mixed in amongst all that are other special events like collectors' fairs and also the Victorian picnics.
The Bluebell also organises one-off events for special anniversaries too. In 2007, for the cavalcade, a large number of locos were in steam. 2009 saw the 50th anniversary of the Bluebell Railway celebrated with a Founders' Day, attended by the original 4 students and Sir Bernard Holden, who's still involved with the society. In 1971, the Bluebell Railway had the foresight to draw up a long-term development plan for the railway. One major decision was the possibility of extending the line, either northwards to East Grinstead or westwards through Ardingly to Haywards Heath. Connection northwards to East Grinstead seemed more practical. To the south of Horsted Keynes, the line branches off westwards, curving right towards Ardingly.
And ultimately we'd like to rebuild that line, and who knows, possibly Haywards Heath one day.
The Bluebell Railway purchased the track bed from Horsted Keynes to the rail track boundary at Ardingly in 1997 when the land became available.
Hopefully one day we'll be back in Haywards Heath, so we've got that kind of aspiration. But there's a number of things that I think we really need to address before we go that far.
On the 15th of August 2009, a brake van carried fare-paying passengers along a 100-metre section of the track for the first time in over 45 years.
Which has been very, very popular indeed, and people have bought tickets for travelling on that. All that money will be donated towards their extension to East Grinstead.
When the former station site at West Hoathly was threatened with redevelopment in 1975, the Society purchased the land and sought planning permission to extend the railway to West Hoathly. Permission was refused. The railway applied again and was yet again refused. Despite owning only a little of the track bed, an application was instead made for planning permission to run trains between Horsted Keynes and East Grinstead, but planning was refused. Forced to seek a public inquiry in 1983, the Bluebell Railway asked for not only planning permission, but a light railway order to enable the Bluebell Railway to run trains over the extension when the line was complete. A year passed. Then in the summer of 1984, Kingscote Station was put up for sale. The railway felt it had little choice but to buy the station, despite not knowing the outcome of the inquiry. Gaining possession of its current northern terminus in January 1985, a small group of volunteers worked every weekend to bring the station back to its former glory. The building had stood empty for 5 years, but despite being unloved, the structure was basically sound. The ticket window and seat in the booking hall remained, but they were the only clues to its former life. Outside, the canopy was more or less intact, but the second platform had been demolished.
And where we're standing now was all behind clear plastic perspex as a little outhouse. The subway was filled in with rubble.
The ex-Brighton Upper Goods signal box was moved to Kingscote in the mid-90s. And Kingscote today depicts a fine example of a sleepy 1950s Southern Railway country station, perfect in every detail. The railway's massive gamble paid off. In March 1985, the public inquiry found in favour of the Bluebell Railway, granting both planning permission and a light railway order for the extension to East Grinstead. Soon afterwards, negotiations resumed with the remaining landowners between Horsted Keynes and Kingscote. As soon as the purchase of the last piece of land was agreed, the first section of track northwards from Horsted Keynes was laid by the then Transport Minister Paul Channon in early 1988. The track to Horsted House Farm, 1 mile north of Horsted Keynes Station, opened to the public a year later in 1989. For 4 years, the Permanent Way gang worked tirelessly, laying the track from Horsted Keynes up to Sharpthorne Tunnel, finally emerging from the north side on the 29th of February 1992. At 731 yards, the 1 in 75 gradient tunnel is the longest on any UK preserved line.
It was extremely wet and horrible inside, and it's supposed to be haunted with two ghosts, but I've never seen them.
The first public train ran through to West Hoathly on the 4th of April, although the official ceremony wasn't until the 16th of May 1992, when the Bluebell Railway's president, Sir Bernard Holden MBE, and Sir Alistair Morton, co-chairman of Eurotunnel and chairman of the Shadow Strategic Rail Authority, reopened the line, and 35027 had the honour of breaking the banner. The Permanent Way gang pressed on towards Kingscote, and in early spring '94, the first trains ran all the way through to Kingscote Station, 6 years after the extension was started. To the far south lies Sheffield Park. Once the station with the fewest passengers, the station is now the headquarters for the Bluebell Railway and home to the Loco Shed. Sheffield Park lost its footbridge in the early 20th century rationalisation, but a new one was installed in March 1985.
I'm in charge of the station staff at Sheffield Park. We have to make sure the place is clean and tidy. I'm responsible for the safety of the line just within the station area.
The Society had a very modest bookstall from the outset, and also impromptu catering facilities. But as the railway grew, so did the demand for better amenities. The bookstall moved into a makeshift lean-to, and then expanded into the donated W.H. Smith stall now at Horsted Canes. The first purpose-built shop opened in 1976, but it became far too small for the Bluebell's level of business. Teas and coffees were available from the beginning, being served from a room in the station to customers sitting at tables and chairs placed outside. In time, an old coach with a canopy was used until finally a purpose-built buffet and restaurant facility was topped out on the 11th of April 1986. Further expansion work commenced in May 2003, and by March 2004, the upgraded offices, Bessemer Arms Real Ale Pub and new enlarged shop were ready to be revealed. Another revenue stream is the Golden Arrow restaurant service. The Bluebell Railway has gained a reputation for fine dining in the luxurious surroundings of Pullman cars.
Because you've got comfortable seats with deep upholstery, armchairs, fantastic interior surroundings with lots of brass and beautiful decorative marquetry work inside the coaches. And along with that experience goes the opportunity to dine on the train, and that's what we create here.
From the humble beginnings with just Stepney and Bluebell plus a couple of carriages operating on the line, the Bluebell Railway now boasts an incredible 33 locomotives and countless coaches and wagons.
We have a very comprehensive historic collection of locomotives that are used on the railway.
Starting out with just a small concrete shed, in the mid-70s work had started on building a locomotive works and running shed at Sheffield Park, enabling complete locomotive overhauls and repairs to be undertaken in-house. The initial motivation for the build had been an £18,000 bill for a complete loco overhaul at Swindon Works. The current running shed was built in the 1990s and finally completed in 2004.
Biggest difficulty for the loco works is shortage of resources. It takes labour and money to keep locomotives running.
It is the money that's always the issue, and of course the older an engine is, the more likely is significant work will require to be done. And you can spend tens of thousands of pounds repairing a boiler.
Most of our income comes from the passengers who travel on the trains, and it's just sufficient to keep just sufficient locomotives in working order to run the trains. But it can be quite a struggle at times to keep enough of them in working order.
Sir Archibald Sinclair, which is in service today, has been returned to traffic after sitting in a scrapyard for about 20 years. Arrived here in '78 and we've been gradually doing it since. But that will have cost us getting on for 750,000, I would guess, to fully restore to its existing condition, and a large chunk of that was very, very heavy boiler repairs.
The quality of the Battle of Britain Locomotive Group's restoration of Sir Archibald Sinclair was such that they were awarded the Southern Railway Group's prestigious Dennis Fletcher Award. Following the demise of steam on the National Rail network, other societies formed in the mid-1960s to purchase both steam locomotives and coaches. The Bluebell Railway welcomed many groups owning locos and coaches forced out by BR in the 1960s. In 1970, the C-Class Society moved their locomotive 592 to Sheffield Park. And in 1971, the Bullied Society arrived with the West Country Pacific 21C123 Blackmore Vale.
Some engines, like the 01 Blackmore Vale in the shed, have been here for an awful long time, and the owners have found a home here and they're quite happy to stay here and leave their engines here.
There's various groups here. You have the Bullied Society, there's the Wainwright Society, the H-Class Trust, the Mansell or Mauntle Society.
The groups brought with them valuable new manpower, skills and expertise. Niall Devitt's group is restoring the BR Standard Class 5 Loco 73082 called Camelot.
And I got active working on one restoration of a locomotive called Camelot, which arrived here in scrapyard condition in '79 and completely stripped, and I've worked on that since '84.
Some of the groups are slightly more ambitious. The Atlantic project is rebuilding Beachy Head. Beachy Head, the Brighton H2 Atlantic locomotive, that is. The loco was cut up and scrapped at Eastleigh in 1958, and the Bluebell launched a fundraising appeal for the restoration in 2000.
Well, it's almost like we've jacked up the whistle and built a new engine underneath.
The project acquired a suitable boiler and tender frame and wheels, plus many of the smaller parts.
We're making the rest of it to hopefully see the engine run again in a few years. It really starts with the drawings. You need those obviously to complete the engine, and we didn't have very many to begin with, but the National Railway Museum were very kind and suggested that we might care to go through their archive, which we've been doing since in fact 2001. They were then redrawn to take into account things like metric sizes and and modern practices. And as soon as we could do that, then we started making components. And at the moment we're making all sorts of patterns and getting castings done for wheels, and we're making the cylinders. There's quite a lot of progress really. We're also buying in finished parts from outside industry. Really depends what we think is the most cost effective.
It's a mixture of people working on the Atlantic project.
There are some paid people and also voluntary people. The majority of work, I think, is done by the volunteers who give up their time, like all preserved railways, to a very great extent, and we would be in deep trouble without them.
All being well, Beachy Head could be back in steam very soon.
The railways originally were a labour-intensive operation. At the peak of the steam-operated railway, there was people everywhere on the railway, and I think that's what we've got here, and that's why we need about 300 people a weekend just to run this railway.
Our turnover is in excess of £3 million, and we have a paid staff complement, so obviously you've got those sorts of financial responsibilities, personnel responsibilities, and of course we have health and safety responsibilities for people who work here, as well as the general operating responsibilities that go with running a company.
Although the Bluebell Railway has over 500 active and very loyal volunteers to call upon, the Society is always in need of more volunteers.
I mean, we're a 7-day operation, literally, and even when the railway isn't operating, we're still working behind the scenes. The volunteers are the lifeblood of the railway. I mean, I give credit to the volunteers. I mean, our volunteers work through all sorts of weathers. They put up with a lot of flack from people sometimes, but they're dedicated and genuinely proud of what they do. And, you know, without them, this railway wouldn't be anything.
People come and work here because they buy into the idea of the Bluebell Railway as being a good thing in itself. So everybody's committed. They'll do all sorts of things which quite often they wouldn't do if they were being paid.
A key part of the future of all volunteer-run steam railways is encouraging youngsters to develop an interest in steam. The Stepney Club was set up in 1989 as a club for 3 to 8-year-olds.
And the 9F Club for the 9 to 15-year-olds. And they go up, and eventually some of them join the roster staff, because the youngsters have got to take over. I mean, we started the railway, but we're all getting old. And this is a lot of other railways have got the same problem, is that, you know, we can't go on forever.
At the moment, our key aim is to get back into East Grinstead. That is really our #1 aim.
The northern extension from Kingscote to East Grinstead has taken far longer than anyone could possibly have envisaged.
It's been fraught with complete difficulty at times, actually, and sometimes you think, why on earth are we doing it? But no, never give up. Take the challenge on and see what needs to be done.
There were a number of major problems, including the difficulty to secure the trackbed at reasonable prices from reluctant owners. Extension plans were again threatened when the earmarked station site at East Grinstead was offered by Railtrack to Sainsbury's. This was a complete shock to the Bluebell. Hill Place Viaduct had been given to the Bluebell Railway by Network Rail in exchange for the Bluebell taking on the maintenance liability for the viaduct. The railway even had a written agreement stating that when the time came to build the Bluebell's East Grinstead station, a strip of land would be provided. Fortunately, the rail regulator rejected the sale of the site to Sainsbury's, and building work for a 7-coach platform began in earnest in 2009. The same year, Hill Place Viaduct, one of the longest viaducts in preservation, was prepared for track to be laid. In doing so, rare access was possible to the chambers inside the viaduct. Heritage lines face enormous challenges in bringing ambitions to reality at the best of times. But the Bluebell had an unusual and complex obstacle to overcome in the push towards East Grinstead. Blocking the proposed line was a 1/4 mile cutting filled to a depth of 60 feet with 100,000 tonnes of municipal waste from the late 60s and early 70s.
The deep cutting south of East Grinstead became available and the town council said, oh good, we can put all the rubbish in there. So they filled it up with domestic rubbish.
Removal of this waste was the only realistic option to allow the railway through. But it was not a simple case of volunteers removing the rubbish. The tip was classified as containing hazardous material and so required the services of a specialist waste removal company. And that's not cheap.
But we're going to eventually hope to raise, we've got to raise another 3.5 million, I think it is, to get rid of the rubbish. And it'll take time. It'll take time. It's not going to happen overnight, but we'll get there. We'll get there.
The first thing to be done in December 1997 was some trial borings at the tip to try and assess the composition of the waste material. By the summer of 2004, the volunteers were laying track near the south end of the tip in readiness for the removal of the spoil by rail. Determined to clear the cutting and get the Bluebell Line into East Grinstead, the railway needed greater public support, and so in 2008, Bluebell launched a share offer, plus a major publicity drive held at the tip in November 2008, when the Lady Mayor of East Grinstead and newsreader Nicholas Owen lent their support. Over 3 weeks in the spring of 2009, an electro-diesel Class 73 carried 10,000 tonnes of spoil from Imberhorn Lane Bridge to a triangle of land at Horsted Canes, where the spoil is being used to landscape a picnic area with access to a small nature reserve. The purpose was to accurately plan for the extraction of the 300,000 cubic metres of potentially dangerous waste in the main tip, and to pinpoint exactly how much waste could be removed to landfill each day and how long the entire process would take.
If it hadn't been for us back in 1960 and doing what we did, will the other heritage railways be around today? If we'd gone under in 1960 and people said, oh well, obviously it doesn't work, we can't do it. But we started here, and when you think about it, all the other railways have sort of come on afterwards. We proved it could be done.
From the early days of the line, Tom Martin documented the Bluebell Railway in his beautiful colour films, capturing some of the Bluebell's great characters and key moments.
The railway, which was once 5 miles long, is now 11, will soon be 12 miles long, and beyond that, 15 miles long.
During overnight engineering work in January 2009, Network Rail connected the Bluebell Railway to the main line at East Grinstead. The track only runs to the viaduct for now, but nonetheless, on Saturday the 17th of January, the 4-VEP unit 3417 Gordon Pettit became the first Bluebell rolling stock to arrive by rail since the Ardingly branch closed in 1963.
And one day, perhaps, you never know, we'll get to East Grinstead. You can walk around the corner and get a train to London.
The Bluebell Railway's motto, Floreat Vapor, meaning to be distinguished for steam, could not be more appropriate. Given the tenacity of the Bluebell Railway's volunteers, absolutely anything is possible.